Before working from home, I used to work at a motel in my town. I typically worked the front desk and handled people checking in and checking out. Sometimes, though, I would pick up shifts as a housekeeper whenever I needed the money or we were short-staffed. On the last day I worked there, I ended up being called in as a housekeeper for a morning shift which started around 6:30 in the morning. I picked up the shift without question, and I made sure to make it to the motel a couple of minutes early so I could grab a cup of coffee and get ready for my shift. As I walked into the lobby, I overheard a few members of the night shift talking about one of the guests. And being the sucker for gossip that I am, I decided to join the conversation. I asked Molly and James, the housekeeper and host that were on duty last night, what had happened, and they told me that it was hard to describe. All night, strange noises had been supposedly coming out of a room toward the end of the first floor, and when I asked what kind of noises, they said sometimes it seems like loud music, and at one point they heard some loud banging noises. But what Molly said was really strange was that when she was out on a smoke break that night and was sitting on the small bench that was located across from 117, the room that the noises were coming out of, she swore she could hear what sounded like splashing around. Immediately I sighed, because I was well aware that sometimes people came to the motel with the intent to party hard and to do illicit activities. These rooms were often the worst to clean, and from the sound of it, whoever the guests were had flooded the room with a tub. This was just my assumption because it had happened before when guests got a little bit tipsy and wanted to enjoy some time in our jacuzzi-style tubs. That was when James and Molly told me the weirdest part about it, and that's when she explained that, along with the occasional sound of water and splashing, she could hear what sounded like someone making grunting noises and loud sobbing sounds. I honestly didn't know what to make of the situation and tried my best not to think about it. All I know was that I was dreading opening up the door to 117 and seeing the mess that was left for me. After a couple more minutes of talking, it was time for the two to clock out and get started with my shift. And once I clocked in and made sure the cart was stocked with cleaning supplies, I began making my way down the line of rooms. As a housekeeper, I always tried to swing by the rooms that were vacant or people had already checked out of and clean them out first. And then when that was done, I would go to the other rooms and check on the guests to see if they needed anything, such as fresh towels or other toiletries. And that morning, there were quite a few rooms on the first floor that were vacant, and thankfully a lot of them were clean. As I made my way down the line and got closer to the room that Molly had been talking about, I couldn't help but notice a distinct smell, and the only thing I could hope it was that it wasn't coming from room 117. After hitting all the rooms that people had checked out of and doing a quick run-through of the vacant rooms, I began making my way past the rooms that were still occupied. As I knocked on a few doors that still had some people behind them, the majority of them told me that they didn't need anything at the moment, so I simply informed them about the complimentary breakfast in the main building and continued to make my way down the line. The time came for me to visit room 117, and as I got close, there was no mistake where the rancid smell had been coming from. Sure enough, it was 117. Before getting too close to the door, I took a deep breath, and then I proceeded to knock. There was no response, so I knocked again and announced myself one more time, and again, there was nothing. It was at the point that I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, the room was unlocked and the door swung open. The smell that poured from the room was enough to make me take a few steps backward and hold back from gagging. I let out a cough and peered into the room. It was too dark to see much, but I could tell that it was empty, and the bathroom door seemed open, so at the time it appeared vacant. So once again, I took in a deep breath, and this time I began making my way into the room. As soon as my foot touched the carpet, I felt a squish under my feet. I let out a sigh as I figured it was water damage from the jacuzzi tub. But when I looked down, I was horrified to find that the carpet had been stained red. I stepped back out of the room and did my best to keep from throwing up. I had never seen that much blood before in my life. As soon as I could catch my breath, I ran as fast as I could back to the desk and notified the police. After about an hour of waiting, multiple police cars arrived and promptly went into the room. After a few moments, they came back out and notified us that there was a partially dismembered body in the tub. They didn't find any IDs in the room, so the victim was deemed a Jane Doe, at least as far as I know. After that day, I couldn't bring myself to go back to work there. I mean, nothing like that had ever happened in our small town, and I never wanted to risk experiencing that ever again. I was traveling home from a business trip in Pennsylvania, and as I made my way back to Arkansas, I hadn't intended on spending money on a room. But after a full night of driving, I figured it might be smart to grab a cheap motel room and catch a couple of hours of sleep before hitting the road again. I looked up the cheapest rooms near me on my phone and was led to a motel that only charged $38 a night. I called them up and booked a room, and once I checked in, I was pleasantly surprised to find that not only did the motel appear to be empty, it was actually a fairly nice room for such a cheap price. After getting settled in, I felt myself getting hungry, and I checked my phone to see the time. It was only about 2 in the afternoon at that point, so I figured I could grab a bite to eat from the McDonald's, then come back to the motel and sleep until midnight. That way I can be back on the road overnight when there was hardly any traffic. When I left my room, I was still happy to see that the parking lot of the motel was still rather empty, which to me meant that it would be a quiet afternoon and I could get some sleep for sure. So I went to go grab a burger, and after a successful trip to McDonald's, I headed back to my room and turned on the TV to unwind. After eating and drawing the curtains closed, it only took me about an hour to get to sleep, and when I did, I was out cold. I have always been told that I was a heavy sleeper, but when I was tired, I became a rock. There was almost nothing that could wake me up, or so I thought. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep, but by the time I had been woken up by the sound of something slamming against the door of my motel room, I could tell that it was dark out, and it was likely the middle of the night. Before I could react to the noise that had woken me up, my door had been busted inward, and multiple men came rushing into my room. I had hardly sat up before one of them grabbed me and tossed me out of the bed and onto the floor. I couldn't get a single word out of the 3 men, who jumped over me and began hitting me over and over and over again with their fists and their elbows. I tried to fight through the pain and figure out what was going on, but there was no fighting back. After a couple more hits to my sides and head, everything went black. By the time I came to, the police were in my room telling me that an ambulance was on the way to take me to the hospital. The men who came into my room had taken everything that I owned, aside from the clothes that I had been wearing, and my bag was gone. My wallet was taken, and my car had been stolen out of the parking lot. As I was talking to the doctors at the hospital who were checking me out, they informed me that this wasn't an odd occurrence, and, in fact, that motel was one of the more dangerous areas in the nearby town. According to them, there had actually been a murder in that motel only 2 months before I stayed. I learned an extremely valuable lesson to look into the town that I planned on staying in. You never know when you are in a dangerous area. My wife and I were planning on moving to Florida for a new job position that I had been given at my company. But before we could move, we had to go back and look at a couple of housing options for us. This meant taking a trip to Florida and spending a few nights in a motel while we looked around at the homes we could afford on our budget. The first day in Florida was great. The weather was beautiful, and the first 2 homes we checked out were actually really nice. Our realtor also had a lot of information for us about the surrounding area and said that we were going to love all the local eateries. That day, we got back to our room shortly before sundown and just relaxed in the air-conditioned room. It was a quiet first night, and the 2 of us slept great. The next morning, we met with our realtor to check another home. That day, we only had 1 listing scheduled to view, and then we planned on getting a quick bite to eat before heading back to our motel to talk about our options. Lunch was delicious, and we had seafood on the local fishing pier and talked a bit more with our realtor about the area. Then sure enough, we headed back to our room expecting to talk about the house we looked at. Sadly, people had checked into the room beside us, and they were quite loud. From what my wife and I could tell at first was a man and woman who had rented the room out for the evening, and from the moment we got back to the room, we could hear yelling. Sometimes it sounded like arguing, but for the most part, all we could hear was the guy violently yelling at the woman about something that had happened earlier that day. We tried not to pay attention to the details or eavesdrop, but after a while, me and my wife got more and more concerned for the safety of this woman. There was a brief moment where the yelling stopped, and we thought that the 2 had reconciled or had even left the motel for all we knew, and we were both happy to have a little peace. However, that was quickly brought to an end when a loud slam came from the room next door. Whatever it was had hit the wall so hard that it nearly knocked the mirror down on our side of the wall. Immediately after the slam, my wife and I heard the woman crying. That was the last straw. I told my wife to call the police and I began to get ready to knock on the door next door to see if everything was okay. But before I could even put my shoes back on, there was a pounding at the door. I ran over to it and looked through the peephole. There was a woman standing on the other side of the door, and she appeared to have a head wound that was causing blood to trail down the side of her face. I quickly opened the door and she ran in crying. As I was shutting the door, I heard the sound of the man who attacked her coming out of the room. I quickly locked the door, and just as I stepped back from it, the man began violently banging on the door. He was yelling to let him in, and I told him that my wife was on the phone with the police and he needs to calm down. For a moment, I thought I had gotten through to him as he seemed to step away from the door. I turned to my wife and the woman who was now holding a rag to the top of her head. My wife had called the police and said that they were on the way, and the three of us sat and waited. The anxious waiting only got tenser when the man who had attacked the woman began banging on the wall in his room that was attached to ours. He began to try to do everything that he could to rip his way through the wall to get to the woman that he was attacking. We were lucky that the police showed up when they did, because by the time they had gotten there, he made a hole large enough to fit his arm and shoulder through from his room into ours. After arresting the man and taking the woman to the hospital, it turned out that she needed 8 stitches. When questioned about the man that she was with that day, it turned out that she had been hitchhiking after running away from her home. She had only just met the man earlier that day when he offered to pay for a room that was supposed to just be hers. We aren't sure exactly what happened with that case after we left Florida, but we hope that that woman made it back home all right and is safe.